In World War II, one American tank crew tore through Europe like something out of a Hollywood war film. Except every moment was real. In just 80 days, they destroyed 258 enemy targets, blew apart 16 German tanks, and sent entire units running at the sight of one name painted on a Sherman. In the mood, this is the story of Lafayette Pool, the deadliest tank Commander America ever produced, and the crew that turned a Sherman into a living nightmare for the German army. The summer of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. After the Allied landings in Normandy, the expectation, at least on paper, was that American armor would pour through the French countryside and roll all the way to the German border. But the reality on the ground was far different. Normandy was a maze of hedgerows, tight lanes, and ambush points where German anti-tank guns waited like coiled snakes. Every mile cost blood. Every crossroad had a story. And among the hundreds of tank crews fighting their way through this brutal landscape, one 5-man crew would do something no American unit had ever matched again. For 81 days, just 81, the crew commanded by Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Pool carved a path so destructive, so relentless, that both American and German soldiers later described it as almost unreal. In less than 3 months, this one tank crew destroyed 12 German tanks, 258 armored and motorized vehicles, and forced more than 1,000 German soldiers out of the fight. These were not inflated propaganda numbers. They came from after-action reports, eyewitness testimony, and cross-checked battlefield records. And they were achieved not by a whole battalion, not by a task force, but by one crew riding 3 different Sherman tanks, each named the same way, in the mood. What made this story so extraordinary wasn't just the staggering amount of damage they dealt. It was the pace. Other tank aces chalked up dozens of kills over years. Pool's crew did it in less than the length of a single NFL season. Their reputations spread quickly. Through the 3rd Armored Division spearhead, an outfit already known for moving fast, hitting hard, and staying on the road long after other units had stopped. Yet even within spearhead, Pool's tank stood out. When the column halted, his was usually at the front. When scouts needed eyes forward, Pool was already there. And when German defenders heard the telltale engine note of American armor approaching, it was often in the mood leading the charge. Lafayette Pool himself was not the kind of man who blended into the background. Born in 1919 in Odem, Texas, he had the physique of a boxer and the reflexes of a natural athlete. Before the war, he had planned on becoming an engineer, but the military changed everything. After basic training, he was sent to Fort Knox, the home of American armored warfare. There, instructors noticed something about him, an instinct for movement, for reading terrain, for sensing danger just a heartbeat before anyone else. He drove aggressively, but not recklessly. He studied German armor and learned its strengths and its weaknesses. By the time he finished training, Pool didn't just know how to command a tank, he knew how to hunt with one. When he joined the 3rd Armored Division, he found men who matched his drive. The gunner, Corporal Willis Groundhog Keel, was quiet, steady, and deadly accurate, exactly the kind of man you want behind the trigger of a 75mm cannon. The driver, Delbert Boggs, was calm under pressure and had the uncanny ability to navigate rubble-filled streets or muddy farm tracks at full throttle without throwing the crew off balance. Assistant driver Wilbert Red Richards handled the bow gun and kept the front of the tank covered. The loader changing over time as casualties shifted, men between crews kept the rhythm going, feeding rounds into the breech as fast as Keel could pull the trigger. They were 5 men packed inside a steel shell barely 30 tons in weight, a machine that was out-armored and outgunned by almost every German tank they encountered. Yet together, they would become one of the most feared and effective American armored crews of the entire war. Before they ever fired a shot in France, the crew had already learned the most important lesson a tank team can learn. Survival depends not on the machine, but on the men inside it. The Sherman had its strength, speed, reliability, and a gun that could knock out most German vehicles if it hit the right spot. But it also had a reputation that every tanker knew too well. German gunners called it the Ronson, after the lighter, because when it was hit, it lit up the first time, every time, inside the 3rd Armored Division. Men joked darkly that the Sherman came with a built-in guarantee. The tank would get you to the battlefield, but from there on, you were on your own. Poole understood all of this from the beginning. At Fort Knox, he drilled his crew relentlessly. Communication had to be fast. Movements had to be instinctive. Keel needed to know what Poole wanted before Poole said it. The driver needed to feel the terrain and trust Poole's voice. Even when bullets were bouncing off the hull, a tank took orders from one man, but it lived or died by all 5. When the 3rd Armored Division finally crossed the English Channel and moved toward Normandy in late June 1944, Poole's crew was more than ready, at least as ready as men could be, for what waited in the hedgerows of France. The division landed after the worst of the D-Day fighting, but the war they stepped into was no less lethal. The fields of Normandy were carved into thousands of small, walled enclosures, hedgerows older than the United States itself, thick enough to stop bullets and high enough to conceal entire platoons. Germans used them like natural fortresses. A Sherman tank moving through that maze was like a bull walking through a hallway, filled with hidden rifles. Poole's first real taste of combat came near Villiers-Fossard, where the crew's first tank, in the Mood-Eye, rolled forward under a sky that still carried the smell of gunpowder from the D-Day battles. The roads were narrow, the air humid, and every turn felt like a coin toss between silence or a German 75mm shell. Waiting around the corner for a new tank crew, the first engagement often exposes fear, hesitation, overcorrection. A delay in returning fire, but not for Poole's men. When the lead American elements were pinned down by a German anti-tank gun hidden behind a hedgerow, Poole didn't stop to debate tactics. He ordered Boggs to push forward at full throttle. The sudden charge shocked the German crew. Keel fired the main gun, sending a high-explosive round straight into the hedgerow. The explosion blasted a hole through the thick vegetation, revealing the smashed remains of the enemy gun. It was the crew's first confirmed kill, and though it was far from the last, it taught them something vital. Aggressive movement, applied faster than the enemy expected, could save their lives. But the Germans were learning too. A few days later, as the Americans pushed through another series of hedgerows, a German infantry team with a Panzerfaust lay in wait. They heard the Sherman approaching the grind of its tracks, the clatter of branches against the hull, and held their fire until the tank was almost on top of them. The blast slammed into in the mood eye, knocking it out instantly. Smoke filled the crew compartment. Flames licked the interior walls. Inside the tank, the temperature spiked in seconds. Boggs was the first out, pulling himself through the hatch as the fire spread. Keel followed, coughing and trying to clear his eyes. Richards jumped last, hitting the ground hard. Poole stayed back long enough to make sure everyone was clear before climbing out himself. The tank was lost, but the crew survived shaken, bruised, and covered in soot, but alive. And for many tankers in Normandy, surviving the loss of a Sherman was already a small miracle. It could have ended there. Many crews never made it past their first tank. But Poole and his men were not like the others. Within days, they were assigned a new Sherman. They named it in the mood to. What they would achieve in that second tank would push them far beyond anything they had imagined. When they first rolled off the landing craft into France, the crew of In the Mood barely had time to breathe after the dash through Coutances. The fields of Normandy were behind them now, but the war wasn't done with them, far from it. Patton's Third Army was finally unleashed, and Poole's battalion was riding at the very tip of the spear. Their orders were always the same: push fast, push hard, and never let the Germans settle into a defensive line. The terrain changed as they thundered across France. Hedgerows gave way to long stretches of open farmland, perfect country for tanks. And it was here, in this wide-open battlefield, that Lafayette Pool became something else entirely. Not just a daring commander, but a hunter, who moved faster, struck harder, and saw farther than the men trying to kill him. By late August, the Germans were retreating in long, broken columns. Trucks, wagons, tanks, half-tracks, anything with wheels was jammed onto the roads fleeing east. Poole smelled opportunity. He stood half out of the turret, goggles on, scanning every bend, every tree line. The fighting had shifted from hedgerow ambushes to something more brutal and relentless. A running pursuit. One afternoon, near the town of Fromental, Poole spotted a distant shimmer on the horizon. Dust, a lot of it. He tapped Boggs' shoulder and pointed. Enemy convoy. Let's hit them before they scatter. Boggs threw the Sherman into gear, and In the Mood roared forward. The American column behind them struggled to keep up. Sergeant Edge braced himself over the .50 cal as Clark loaded armor-piercing rounds. They crested a small rise and saw it a German column nearly a mile long. Trucks loaded with infantry, a few armored cars, and, farther down the line, to self-propelled guns trying to pivot into firing position. Pool didn't hesitate. "Take the lead gun first," he yelled. Clark rammed an AP round into the breech. Boggs lined up the shot. The Sherman fired and the German gun erupted in a fireball. The column panicked. Trucks veered into ditches. Soldiers leaped for cover. Engines screamed as drivers tried to turn around on a road far too narrow. Pool drove straight into the chaos. Edge swept the tree lines with machine gun fire, cutting down any crew trying to get their guns into action. The second German gun shouted a flash of orange and thundered a shell past them. It missed by inches, carving a crater into the road behind. Clark loaded again, faster than anyone had a right to. Pool steadied Boggs with a hand on his shoulder. The gun fired. The second vehicle exploded, flipping partially onto its side. For 20 minutes the scene was nothing but smoke, ricochets, screaming engines, and the sharp, mechanical rhythm of the Sherman's 75. By the time it was over, the road was a twisted graveyard of burning vehicles. German soldiers fled in small groups across the fields. Some threw up their hands the moment Pool's tank turned toward them. When the rest of the 32nd Armored caught up, they found the crew standing on the hull, covered in soot, still catching their breath. Officers from other companies shook their heads in disbelief. One muttered, "Pool goes places we haven't scouted yet. Hell, he goes places nobody's even thought about scouting." The praise didn't interest Pool. He just wiped sweat and grime from his eyes and asked Clark how many rounds they had left. The loader shrugged. "Not enough for another one of those." That became a pattern. Again and again, Pool's crew found themselves racing ahead, smashing through roadblocks, scattering German rearguards, overrunning command posts. The men trusted him completely. Pool had a sense-an instinct for where the enemy would be, how fast they were moving, and what they could do next. It wasn't something you learned in a manual. It was something born from surviving nearly continuous combat since June. But the war wasn't going to let him escape unscathed. In early September, as the 3rd Armored approached the German border near Liege, the terrain shifted again. More forests, more fog, more hills. It felt like danger was thick in the air. The Germans were no longer fleeing in panic. They were fighting for their homeland now, and every mile east became harder. Near the town of Monschau, the mood rolled up to a narrow road that cut through a steep, wooded ridge. Pool didn't like it. The pass was too quiet, too narrow, too perfect for an ambush. He told Boggs to slow the tank to a crawl. Edge scanned the treetops. Clark held a shell ready, his hands tense. Halfway through the pass, Pool spotted it, a glint of metal in the trees, too high to be a rifle barrel. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the world flashed white. A German artillery shell detonated above them, showering the tank with shrapnel. The blast felt like a giant's fist smashing into the turret. Edge ducked so fast he slammed his head into the hatch rim. Clark was thrown to the floor. Boggs kept the tank moving. Smart, Pool thought. Stopping inside a kill zone was suicide. Another explosion rocked the ridge. This one hit directly behind the tank, sending dirt and splinters raining down. Machine gun fire erupted from the right side of the pass. Now they were in its landed on high ground, with no room to maneuver. Pool's voice cut through the chaos. "Ram it! Get us through!" Boggs didn't hesitate. The tank lunged forward, its engine screaming as it pushed toward the end of the pass. Clark loaded high explosive. Edge fired bursts to suppress the tree line. Then, finally, they broke out into open ground. The pass widened, the trees fell away, and the German guns couldn't track them anymore. The crew kept going until they were well clear, hearts still pounding. Poole climbed out of the turret and looked back at the ridge. Smoke drifted lazily from the treetops. He shook his head. That was too damn close. He didn't know it yet, but this escape marked the beginning of the end. The deeper they pushed into Germany, the more desperate and determined the enemy became. And for the first time, Poole felt a quiet, unfamiliar thought tugging at him. How many more times can we survive this? He pushed it aside. The mission wasn't over. The hunt wasn't done. And in the mood still had roads to conquer before the war decided to collect its debt. As September deepened, the weather turned colder, wetter, the kind of damp that soaked through a tanker's jacket and made every metal surface feel like ice. Poole's crew pushed through it anyway. Orders came down that 3rd Armored was to seize the approaches. To occupy the first major German city the Americans would face. And standing in the way were the West Wall fortifications. The Germans had been quietly preparing for years. The Siegfried Line wasn't a rumor anymore. It was steel, concrete, bunkers, Dragon's Teeth mile after mile of obstacles built for one purpose: to stop exactly the kind of momentum Poole and his crew had been driving since Normandy. The day they reached the outskirts of the line, the sky hung low and grey. Rain misted across the ground, turning fields into mud pits. The terrain forced the tanks into narrow approaches where anything could be waiting. In the mood felt like a giant target lumbering toward a shield wall. But Poole never let caution turn into paralysis. He studied the terrain through his binoculars and pointed toward a gap between two rises. "We'll break through there," he told Boggs. "Fast, before they adjust." Edge tightened the strap on his helmet. "Feels too quiet," he muttered. Clark loaded his rounds. Quiet never means good. They moved forward, engine humming low in 2nd gear. The gap looked harmless grass, a few brush patches, no visible trenches or bunkers. But halfway through the clearing, something flickered on the right ridge. A puff of smoke. A split second later, a German 75mm shell screamed down and punched into the dirt beside them, showering the tank with earth. Boggs instinctively cranked the wheel. Poole shouted over the impact, "Hard left, hard left. Get eyes on that ridge." Another shell came in, this one exploding close enough to rock the tank sideways. Clark steadied himself, slammed, and he round home, and waited. Boggs brought the tank around, and there it was, a camouflaged bunker mouth tucked under tree branches. "Fire!" Poole yelled. The Sherman's 75 barked. the shot hitting just beside the bunker slot. Chunks of concrete flew, but the gun kept firing. The second enemy round struck closer, narrowly missing the turret and blasting mud across Pool's goggles. He wiped them clean with the back of his glove and shouted again, "Load armor-piercing." Clark grabbed an AP round, slammed it into the breech. Boggs steadied the hull on a patch of firmer ground. Edge, above them, raked the tree line with .50 cal fire, keeping German infantry from flanking. The next American round slid perfectly through the bunker's firing slit. A thunderclap echoed from inside as the charge detonated. Smoke poured out of the opening. The German gun fell silent, but the moment they disabled it, two more guns opened up from the opposite ridge. Pool cursed. The Germans had designed the terrain to kill tanks exactly like his, and they were good at it. Boggs backed the Sherman into a small depression just as a shell zipped past their previous spot. Clark could barely hear anything. His ears rang from the constant firing. Pool made a fast decision. "We can't win a duel here. Break contact. Find another approach." Boggs threw the tank into reverse, engine groaning as they backed down the slope. Shells crashed around them, one smashing into a tree that toppled almost directly onto their path. But they got clear. They regrouped with the rest of the battalion, shaken but alive. Officers gathered around maps, arguing about routes. Most of the day was spent probing, scouting, and trying to find a way through the German defenses. The crew stayed near their tank, drinking lukewarm coffee and listening to distant artillery. By late afternoon, someone finally spotted a weakness on unguarded service road behind a small ridge. One the Germans likely assumed was too narrow for armor. Pool saw it differently. "It'll fit us," he told the commanders. "Barely, but it's the best shot we've got." A major looked at him skeptically. "You take that road, you're on your own." Pool shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." Permission came reluctantly. In the mood led the wedge again. The service road was choked with fallen branches and rubble, but Boggs coaxed the Sherman through inch by inch. The sides of the tank scraped rock. Tree trunks brushed the armor with harsh screeches. Clark braced himself inside, feeling every shudder through his boots. Then the road opened onto the rear of the German defensive line. Pool froze. Dozens of German infantry were set up facing the opposite direction, firing down toward another American unit locked in a firefight. Machine gun nests, mortars, and at gun none of them aimed at in the mood. Pool didn't waste a heartbeat. Edge, mow them down. Boggs, take us straight into their rear. What followed was minutes of pure chaos. Edge's .50 tore through German positions. Clark loaded he non-stop, sweating as shell casings piled around his ankles. Boggs pushed the tank forward, right into the enemy guns. German soldiers ran, dove for cover, some raising their hands before the tank even reached them. Viet crew tried to swing their gun around, but Pool hit them with direct fire before they could get the breach closed. Within 10 minutes, the entire rear line had collapsed. The pressure on the American infantry up front disappeared almost instantly. When the fighting settled, officers from the other unit approached Pool's Sherman with looks halfway between disbelief and gratitude. "You just broke open the Siegfried line for an entire regiment," one of them said. Poole only nodded. He didn't need praise. He needed resupply badly. Clark reported they were nearly out of every type of round. Edge's barrels were hot enough to cook on. Boggs leaned back in his seat, exhausted. That night, as the rain came down harder, Poole stood on the hull and stared eastward. The map said they were still miles from Germany's heart, Cologne, the Rhine, cities untouched by American hands. The war was shifting into a new phase, one that felt heavier, darker. But Poole wasn't slowing down. He ordered the crew to get some rest. Tomorrow they would push again. What none of them knew was that the next breakthrough would not end in applause or survival. The war was spinning toward its bloodiest, most personal chapter, and In the Mood was heading straight into it. By late September, In the Mood was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol. Soldiers from other units pointed at it when it rolled by, whispering, "That's Poole's tank, the one that never stops." Infantrymen cheered when they saw the familiar Sherman racing ahead. Even officers, hardened by months of combat, stepped aside and let Poole lead the advance without question. He had earned it with results no one else came close to matching. But the relentless pace came at a cost. The crew was exhausted physically, mentally, spiritually. They slept sitting up against ammunition crates, boots still on, helmets resting on their chests. Every clang of metal or distant artillery blast snapped them awake. Clark's hands had permanent bruises from ramming shells into the breech. Edge had a scar across his cheek from shrapnel that nearly took his eye. Boggs drove with his fingers taped because the controls tore at his skin. Poole carried the heaviest weight of all, the responsibility of keeping them alive. In the first days of October, the battalion pushed toward the industrial city of Aachen, where German resistance stiffened into something ferocious. Buildings collapsed from artillery fire. Streets were choked with rubble. Snipers hid in blown-out rooms. Every intersection felt like a trap. The crew entered a town south of Aachen on a gray, miserable morning. Smoke drifted down the streets like ghosts. The place looked abandoned to abandoned. Poole narrowed his eyes. "Stay sharp. This doesn't smell right." Boggs eased In the Mood forward. Edge scanned the rooftops, the .50 swiveling from window to window. As they crept around a corner, Poole suddenly spotted it. A camouflaged German half-track tucked behind a collapsed building. Engine running, waiting. The moment the Sherman appeared, the enemy vehicle lurched forward to cut off the road. "Ram him?" Poole yelled. Boggs didn't hesitate. The Sherman slammed forward like a bull. The half-track fired wildly, bullets pinging off the tank's armor. Then the vehicles collided, metal grinding, glass shattering. The half-track flipped onto its side, wheels spinning helplessly. German infantry scattered. Edge opened up. Clark fed round after round, firing point-blank into the positions behind the rubble. The street filled with smoke and screams as the Germans broke and ran. When the gunfire faded, the crew took a moment to breathe. Clark wiped sweat from his eyes. Edge leaned back from the hatch, chest heaving. Boggs grinned tiredly and said, Well, that woke me up. But the day wasn't done. Orders came down that the battalion needed to capture a small bridge outside Stolberg before the Germans could blow it. Losing that bridge would slow the entire 3rd Armored advance. Pool's company was chosen to lead the dash, and, as always, Pool was at the very front. They moved fast, racing along a narrow country road flanked by open fields. The sky was a heavy slate gray. Rain threatened but never fell. The air felt electric, tense. Halfway to the bridge, Edge spotted movement. Armor, right flank. Pool whipped around and saw 3 German vehicles cresting a rise to tank destroyers. An A mark for tank. The Germans fired first. A shell whistled over in the mood, exploding in a field behind them. The second round hit the road in front of Boggs, blowing a crater across their path. "Hold steady," Pool shouted. "We take the tank first." Clark slammed in an AP round. Boggs swung the Sherman toward the Mark IV. The American gun fired and hit the German tank square in the turret ring. The crew inside never had a chance. Flames erupted from the hatches. The 2 tank destroyers shifted their aim. One fired and missed. The other shell skipped off the Sherman's side armor, but rattled the crew hard enough to knock Clark against the gun housing. Boggs pushed forward aggressively, shortening the distance. Pool understood the advantage instinctively. The closer they were, the harder it was for the German gunners to adjust. Their second shot smashed into the first tank destroyer, blowing off a tread. As it tried to pivot for another shot, Edge raked the escaping crew with machine gun fire. But the last German vehicle was lining up a clean shot. Pool shouted, "Fire!" Clark worked faster than he thought humanly possible. The shot punched through the tank destroyer's thin armor. A plume of black smoke rose instantly. When the fireball faded, the road was silent. Boggs exhaled shakily. That was too close. Pool didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon. The bridge was still ahead. The enemy was running, but they weren't beaten. Not yet. They reached the outskirts of Stolberg just as German engineers were preparing charges under the bridge. In the mood opened fire from distance, scattering the demolition team. American infantry rushed forward to secure the span. For the first time in days, the battalion felt a surge of triumph. And yet, even as the men embraced and slapped the tank's armor, Pool remained quiet. Something in his gut told him their luck was thinning, fraying at the edges, for straight months. In the mood had rushed headfirst into fire, taken hits that should have killed them, survived situations no other tank would have crawled out of. Eventually, the odds had to balance. Even the best crew in the division couldn't outrun fate forever. That night, under a sky lit only by distant artillery flashes, Pool sat on the hull alone. He rubbed his hands together against the cold. The sounds of men laughing, eating, cleaning weapons drifted around him. But he couldn't join them. Not tonight. The feeling gnawed at him. Tomorrow they would push again, toward the Rhine, toward the heart of Germany, toward an enemy fighting with its back against the wall. He looked down at the tank his tank scarred, blackened, pocked with shrapnel marks, We can't keep taking these chances, Poole thought. But he also knew the truth. He wasn't going to stop. The next day would be their boldest advance yet. And it would also be their last ride in the Mood. Morning broke on October 29, 1944, with a pale, washed-out sun hanging over the countryside near Munsterbush. Mist clung low to the ground, turning the fields into a grey, shifting ocean. It was eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, there were no artillery echoes, no machine gun bursts in the distance. Just the low rumble of engines warming up. Poole didn't like it. Quiet meant the enemy was repositioning, planning, or waiting. And in this part of Germany, waiting usually came with a trap. In the Mood, the third tank to bear the name rumbled at the head of the column. The crew had slept barely 3 hours. Boggs looked pale. Edge was fighting off a cough. And Clark's hands were so blistered he wrapped them in cloth before touching the shells. Poole climbed halfway out of the turret, scanning the fog with narrowed eyes. "Stay sharp," he said quietly. "Feels like we're driving into someone else's plan." Boggs tried to lighten the mood. "Sir, every damn day feels like that." But even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. The battalion's orders were simple but dangerous. Cut through the outskirts, reach a small rail line, and clear it before German reinforcements could move supplies deeper into the city. Fast, aggressive, no delay. They moved along a narrow road bordered by trees and patches of open field. The fog made everything ghost-like: fences, houses, old barns. Edge kept the .50 pointed ahead, finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. Clark sat ready with an AP round, listening to the engine hum through the steel floor. A mile into the advance, Poole suddenly stiffened. Through the fog, a shape flickered tall, blocky, wrong, too big to be a truck, too square to be a barn. Boggs, stop. Poole barked. But he was too late. A massive German tank destroyer, a Jagd Panzer IV, materialized through the mist like a predator. Its long 75mm gun was already aimed straight at Poole's tank. "Reverse! Reverse! Reverse!" Poole yelled. Boggs slammed the controls backward, treads grinding, mud churning. Clark braced. Edge shouted something lost in the engine roar. The German gun fired. The world went white. The shell hit just in front of the Sherman, exploding into a geyser of dirt and shrapnel. The shockwave slammed the tank backward. Edge was nearly thrown from the hatch. Clark hit his shoulder against the interior wall. Boggs fought the controls, dragging the tank back behind a small rise. "Jesus, that thing's huge." Poole's voice was steady, controlled. "We flank it. It's slow in the fog. We move left, circle." He didn't finish. A second German gun fired from the tree line. A different weapon, a different angle. This time, the shell slammed directly into the Sherman's right track. A deafening boom. Steel shrieked. The tank lurched violently and stopped dead. Poole grabbed the hatch rim as the world spun. Smoke filled the inside. Clark coughed, choking. Boggs shouted that the right track was gone, completely blown off. In the Mood was immobile, a sitting duck, Get out. Pool yelled. Everybody out. Now. Edge dropped from the turret first, rolling off the hull and hitting the mud hard. Clark scrambled up next, dragging himself through the loader's hatch, coughing through smoke. Boggs climbed out of the driver's hatch, dazed, ears ringing. Poole was the last to stand in the turret. Then the German gun fired again. A shell ripped into the left side of the tank. The explosion lifted Poole off his feet. Shrapnel tore through his leg, shredding muscle and bone. He fell from the turret and crashed into the mud below. Clark and Edge sprinted back, grabbing their commander under the arms. Boggs yelled, "Medics! Medics!" Poole felt the world fading in and out. His leg, he couldn't feel his leg. He looked down and saw why. Shrapnel had severed it below the knee. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. American infantry laid suppressive fire toward the tree line. Another tank moved up to engage the German destroyer. Medics rushed forward, dropping beside Poole as Edge and Clark pulled back, firing their rifles toward the enemy. Poole's vision blurred. He felt cold creeping over him. He tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. "Is everyone out?" Clark knelt beside him, face streaked with mud and soot. "We're out, sir. We're all out. You saved us. We're good." Poole nodded weakly and closed his eyes as the medics worked to stop the bleeding. He didn't hear the roar of the American tank that finally destroyed the German gun. He didn't hear the cheers when the crew finished pulling the others to safety. All he heard was the distant rumble of war drifting away as he slipped into unconsciousness. When he woke again, he was in a field hospital. His left leg was gone. His war was over. In the mood. The tank that had carried him across France, Belgium, and into Germany was a burned-out wreck somewhere on a muddy road. Lafayette Pool never returned to tank command. He lived, but the battlefield would never see him again. Yet his legacy survived in numbers that seemed impossible. 258 enemy vehicles destroyed. Over 1,000 enemy soldiers killed or captured. 3 tanks lost all under him. Not a single member of his crew killed. For a brief, blazing 4-month span, he was the most deadly tanker the United States ever fielded. A man who fought at the front of every advance, who pushed farther and faster than anyone thought possible, who carried the war on his shoulders until destiny finally demanded a price. And though he left the battlefield on a stretcher, bleeding into German soil, the men of 3rd Armored would never forget the commander who led from the front, stood in the open turret, and charged through fire as if fear did not apply to him. Lafayette Pool's final ride in the mood was over. His legend was just beginning. The war moved on without him. While Lafayette Pool lay in a hospital bed behind the front lines, the men of 3rd Armored Division pressed deeper into Germany, fighting in the frozen forests of the Hurtgen and later in the Battle of the Bulge. His tank, what remained of in the mood, was eventually hauled off the road and scrapped. Just another burned-out vehicle in a war filled with thousands of them. But to the men who had served beside him, in the mood was never just another tank. It had been a spearhead, a battering ram, a shield. It had been the home of a crew that somehow kept surviving the unsurvivable. Pool's crew visited him as soon as they could. Boggs arrived first. He stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, shifting from one foot to the other, unsure what to say. Pool broke the silence himself. "We should have seen them earlier," he said quietly. Boggs shook his head. "Sir, we couldn't have. Nobody could have." Edge came next. He set down a chocolate bar he'd been saving for weeks, his only luxury. "That's for you, Commander," he said. "And you better eat it, 'cause if you don't, I will." Clark visited last. He said nothing for a long time, staring at Pool's bandaged stump. Then he finally exhaled and said, "If you didn't stop to yell for us to get out, you'd have died in that turret, sir." Pool closed his eyes. He knew it was true. He also knew he'd make the same choice 1,000 times. A tank commander's job was to bring his men home. The tank was expendable. He was expendable. They weren't. After weeks of surgeries, he was shipped back to the United States. The war in Europe ended while he was still recovering. Germany surrendered in May 1945. He listened to the radio, broadcast from a small rehabilitation center in Texas. Other veterans around him cheered, threw their caps, hugged nurses. Pool didn't cheer. He just stared quietly out the window and let the weight of it all settle. He had survived Normandy, survived the Siegfried Line, survived 3 tanks destroyed under him. But part of him felt hollow. A soldier's life, once tied so tightly to the thunder of engines and the crack of gunfire, now felt strangely silent, still. He moved on. He married, raised children, returned to civilian life. In time, he even re-enlisted despite the missing leg and served as an instructor during the Korean War, teaching young tankers how to survive the same way he had, with aggression, teamwork, and absolute trust in each other. His men from in the mood scattered across the country, but they stayed in touch. They wrote letters. They visited. They carried the bond of combat that no one outside their world could fully understand. Each of them credited Pool for keeping them alive. All of them knew they had lived because of him for the rest of his life. Pool never spoke of his kill count unless asked. He didn't brag. He didn't boast. When someone called him the greatest American tanker of the war, he shook his head and said the title belonged to all the crews who never made it home. But the record remained. Across just 81 days of continuous combat, Lafayette Pool and his 5-man crew destroyed more armored vehicles than any other American tank unit in World War II. Their speed, precision, and ferocity helped shape the rapid Allied advance from Normandy to the German border. They cracked defensive lines. They saved infantry pinned under fire. They led the charge when others hesitated. They were the tip of the spear. Pool died in 1991. Decades after the war that had defined him. At his funeral, men who had served with him, some old, some frail, all weathered by time, spoke quietly about the commander who stood half out of his turret, shouting orders over the roar of the engine, urging them forward into the smoke. They remembered a man who led from the front, A man who never asked his crew to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. A man who faced death so many times that fate finally had to take something from him to make him stop. But even with a leg gone, even with the war behind him, his legacy remained untouched. Lafayette Pool didn't just fight in a tank. He defined what an American tank commander could be. And long after the tracks of In the Mood faded from the mud of Europe, the legend of the crew who rode in it continued, born on the stories of the men who survived because of him, and in the history books that still count him, even now, as the most lethal U.S. tanker who ever lived.